Picture this. A single lamp, yellow light pooling across a desk, buried under overnight cables, maps bristling with pins along every wall, the air thick with tobacco and old paper. Outside, London sleeps under the weight of a war that has ground on for nearly 5 years. But inside this corner office in the cabinet war rooms, Winston Churchill is already awake, already reading, already calculating. And what he is about to discover in those pages will force him to make a choice that most history books have never properly explained. If you want history told the way it actually happened, backed by the documents and the diaries, you are exactly where you need to be. This is WW2 Dark Legacy. And before we go any further, if this kind of deep archival storytelling is what you come here for, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what we are about to walk through is one of the most revealing episodes of the entire Second World War, and almost nobody tells it this way. The date is the 28th of July, 1944. 52 days have passed since the largest amphibious landing in recorded history put Allied forces ashore on the beaches of Normandy. 52 days, and the morning situation reports, spread across Churchill's desk, still say the same thing they have been saying for 7 weeks. Progress is slow. 9 miles inland from Sword Beach sits the city of Caen, a transportation hub of roughly 60,000 people. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had expected to take it on the 6th of June itself, or within days at most. It is now nearly the end of July, and Caen is still not fully in Allied hands. Churchill reaches for a cable marked for his eyes only. It is from Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the man who has spent nearly 3 years standing between Churchill's impatience and Britain's generals. Brooke has been passing along explanations from Montgomery, and the explanations, Churchill has noticed, keep changing. First it was German resistance, then it was terrain, then it became a deliberate strategy of drawing enemy armor toward the British sector to open space for the Americans on the other flank. But now, something new has started appearing in Montgomery's messages, a different kind of explanation entirely. And when this pattern first surfaced in Brooke's published war diaries, the dates had to be checked twice, because what Montgomery was doing in those weeks had consequences that would echo through every major operation that remained in the war. Montgomery was blaming the Americans. In messages to Brooke and in conversations with British officers, Montgomery was suggesting that American failures elsewhere along the front were complicating his own operations, that American generals did not understand modern warfare, that British forces could have moved faster if the Americans were not holding things back. Churchill sets the cable down, and the question that confronts him in that quiet office carries a weight that goes far beyond military operations. What does a prime minister do when his most famous general begins pointing fingers at his most important ally? He sends for Brooke. He calls for a private conversation. And what happened in that conversation, and in the weeks that surrounded it, is documented across verified sources that can be cross-referenced against one another. Brooke's war diaries, Churchill's personal correspondence, General Omar Bradley's memoir, George Patton's diary entries, and the parliamentary record from Hansard. The picture those sources assemble together is not the Churchill that most people carry in their minds, not the defiant bulldog. What they reveal is a prime minister doing very quiet, very precise arithmetic, calculating what Britain could afford and what it absolutely could not. To understand what Churchill said and why it mattered as much as it did, we need to go back to what was actually happening at Caen and what Montgomery was actually doing there, because the gap between intention and reality opened faster than almost anyone has acknowledged. On the 6th of June 1944, Operation Overlord begins. Allied forces come ashore on 5 beaches along the Normandy coastline. General Dwight Eisenhower commands. As Supreme Allied Commander, Montgomery commands all Allied ground forces in the initial phase. The plan is straightforward on paper. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery will advance inland and capture Caen, while American forces under General Omar Bradley seize the port of Cherbourg to the northwest and then push south into the French interior. Caen is a D-Day objective. Montgomery's own planning documents reference it explicitly. The British 3rd Infantry Division, landing at Sword Beach, is tasked with capturing the city and establishing a bridgehead over the River Orne by nightfall on the 6th of June. By nightfall on the 6th of June, British forces have not reached Caen. The 21st Panzer Division has moved into blocking positions between the beaches and the city. The opening has closed. A week passes. 2 weeks. 3. June becomes July. Caen remains German. Montgomery launches Operation Epsom at the end of June. 6 days of brutal fighting southwest of the city, with the British VA Corps pushing toward the Odon River. The attack gains ground, but does not break through. By the 10th of July, as the military historian Carlo D'Este would later document, taking Caen on any kind of reasonable schedule would have required something approaching a miracle. 7 panzer divisions, representing the majority of all German armor in Normandy, have concentrated against the British sector. This fact, this genuine and verifiable concentration of German armored strength, is the figure Montgomery will return to again and again. And it is real. It matters. But it is only part of the story, and Montgomery was using it in 2 ways simultaneously that cannot quite be reconciled with each other. Version 1. The slow progress was deliberate and strategic. By holding German armor in the east, Montgomery was creating the conditions for an American breakout in the west. The plan was working exactly as designed. Version 2. The slow progress was someone else's fault. Working through the sequence of Montgomery's messages to Brooke from late June and early July of 1944, the shift between those 2 positions is not clean. They coexist, sometimes within the same communication, sometimes within the same week. In a message documented in Brooke's diary from late June, Montgomery told Brooke that American forces had been unable to capture St. Lo, and that this was creating complications for British operations. He was referring specifically to Bradley's U.S. First Army fighting through the bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country that turned every field into a fortified position. Tall earthen banks, topped with trees and undergrowth, sunken lanes invisible from the air, every hedgerow line a potential ambush. American infantrymen were dying to move 50 yards. The progress was slow, because the terrain and a determined, experienced enemy made it slow. In Montgomery's messages, according to what Brooke's diary records, the bocage does not appear. American failure appears instead. These criticisms were reaching American commanders. Bradley, writing in his 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story. Records becoming aware that Montgomery was simultaneously claiming his Caen stalemate was deliberate strategic design, while attributing his complications to American inadequacy. Bradley's assessment was measured but precise. Montgomery was having it both ways. Patton, whose diary entry from the 25th of July 1944 is available in the historical record, was less diplomatic in his phrasing. But before Churchill's private confrontation with Brooke, one more event has to be placed into the sequence, because without it, the full force of what Churchill was responding to cannot be felt. Operation Goodwood, the 18th to the 20th of July, 1944. What the official histories often move past quickly is the distance between what Montgomery sent to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, before Goodwood, and what he actually ordered his subordinates to execute. That gap is one of the most telling documents in the entire Normandy campaign. Montgomery assembles the largest British armored force of the entire war, 3 full armored divisions, the Guards, the 7th, and the 11th, with well over 1,000 tanks between them, attacking on a narrow corridor east of Caen. The preliminary air bombardment involves nearly 1,000 Royal Air Force heavy bombers, along with hundreds of American bombers, dropping several thousand tons of bombs on the German positions. The operation begins at 5:25 in the morning, on the 18th of July. The messages Montgomery sends to headquarters in advance of the attack describe something that might achieve a major breakthrough. He tells his troops to head for Falaise, a town deep behind German lines. Canadian prisoners later interrogated by the Germans describe Monty telling them they were marching on Paris. 3 days before the assault, Montgomery quietly revises his orders to his subordinates, removing Falaise as an objective. He does not inform Supreme Headquarters of the change. By the 20th of July, the operation is stalled. British and Canadian forces have advanced roughly 7 miles at a cost. Historians place at well over 3,000 casualties and several hundred tanks, though exact figures are still debated by historians. The Bourgabus Ridge, the commanding high ground south of Caen, remains in German hands. Eisenhower, according to multiple accounts from officers present at headquarters, feels he has been deliberately misled. His deputy, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, begins actively advocating for Montgomery's removal. Senior Royal Air Force commanders are furious, in terms that go beyond military frustration. They had released their bombers on the explicit promise of airfields to be captured south of the city. There are no airfields. The land is still German. Churchill had been following Goodwood closely. He'd been told to expect something significant. When it failed to materialize, according to multiple accounts preserved in his correspondence, he concluded the operation had been oversold. On the 21st of July, 1944, Churchill sends a private message to Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the South African statesman and one of his closest wartime advisors. The message is preserved in Churchill's papers. He writes that the operation achieved little at very heavy cost, and that he is not satisfied. That same morning, Churchill visits Montgomery's headquarters in Normandy in person. He examines the maps. He listens to the explanations. He leaves, according to Brooks' record, publicly satisfied enough to support his general, but not convinced. 5 days later comes the private conversation that defines this entire episode. According to Brooks' diary entry for the 26th of July, 1944, Churchill raises the question of Montgomery's criticisms of American forces directly with Brooke. He states that blaming the Americans is not helpful, and that it risks damaging the alliance at precisely the moment the alliance cannot afford to be damaged. And then, he says, in language Brooke preserves in his diary, that Montgomery must not make enemies of the Americans. We depend on them utterly. Read those words slowly. We depend on them utterly. Read them alongside the strategic context of the summer of 1944, and the arithmetic becomes visible immediately. By that point in the war, the United States had placed more than 2 million men into the European theater. American industrial production was supplying not only American forces, but significant portions of British and Soviet logistics. American oil, American trucks, American aircraft engines, American food. Britain, by contrast, was drawing on manpower reserves that were nearly exhausted. The British Second Army in Normandy was suffering casualty rates that, according to official records, forced Montgomery to break up at least one infantry division simply to generate replacements for other units. The British could not sustain losses at the pace the campaign was demanding. Churchill knew this with a precision that Montgomery either did not share or chose to set aside. The alliance was not a diplomatic arrangement or a wartime courtesy. It was a structural condition on which every remaining British military operation depended. When Montgomery blamed the Americans in his communications up the chain of command, he was applying pressure to that foundation from the inside. Churchill also told Brooke something else in this period, recorded in the diary entries from late July. He made a comparison between Montgomery's progress and what Patton had accomplished in Sicily in 1943. The implication required no clarification. Patton, Churchill's comparison suggested, would not have spent 6 weeks in front of Caen. This was as close as Churchill would come in private to saying openly what many officers at Supreme Headquarters were already saying aloud. The 25th of July, 1944. The same day Patton's diary records his frustration with Montgomery's retroactive explanations. The Americans launch Operation Cobra. Reading the sequence of these events, Goodwood failing on the 20th, Churchill's private statement on the 26th, and Cobra launching on the 25th, it becomes apparent that Churchill already understood what the Americans were preparing. He'd been given enough information about the plan that his defense of American forces in the Brook conversation was not purely reactive. It was, in some measure, preemptive. Bradley's plan for Cobra is a model of precision. He requests an unprecedented heavy bomber strike on a narrow section of the German line near Saint-Lô, roughly 3.5 miles wide. More than 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, along with medium bombers and fighter bombers, drop several thousand tons of ordnance on German positions. The bombing produces catastrophic damage to the Panzer Lehr division holding that sector. The German commander estimates afterward that he lost around 70% of his effective combat strength in under an hour. 7 Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, advances through the breach. Within 48 hours, the German 7th Army reports multiple ruptures in the line. By the 30th of July, American forces have captured Avranches, the gateway out of Normandy, entirely. The 30th Infantry Division's message from that day is recorded in the operational history. The thing is busted wide open. On the 1st of August, 1944, at noon, Patton's Third Army is officially activated. He turns his armored divisions east, west, and south simultaneously. More than 100,000 troops are moving through a gap less than 5 miles wide. The speed has no precedent on the Western Front since 1940. Within days of Cobra's success, Montgomery issues a statement claiming that his operations around Caen had created the conditions for the American breakthrough. There is a kernel of truth buried in this. German records do confirm that 7 panzer divisions were concentrated against the British sector when Cobra launched, meaning fewer armored reserves were available to block the American advance. That was real. It had consequences. But working through the German operational orders from the second half of July, cross-referenced against what Montgomery was telling Brooke during the same period, a different picture emerges from the one Montgomery presented after the fact. The German concentration on the British front was not primarily the result of Montgomery's operations drawing them there as part of a deliberate design. It was primarily the result of German command decisions responding to genuine British threats. Those are related phenomena, but they are not the same phenomenon. Bradley notes in A Soldier's Story that Montgomery's attempt to claim strategic credit for Cobra was received poorly at the command level. The point Bradley makes is specific and documented. Whatever benefit the British sector's pressure may have provided, American forces achieved their breakthrough through their own planning, their own tactical adaptations to the bocage, and their own sacrifice, including the friendly fire losses from the preliminary bombing that killed more than 110 American soldiers before the attack had even properly begun. Churchill's response occupied a different register from either Bradley's restrained memoir prose or Patton's diary entries. On the 2nd of August, 1944, Churchill sends a message to Eisenhower. According to the preserved correspondence, he praises the American advances in terms that contain no hedging, no qualification, no credit redistributed toward the British sector, the fighting qualities of American forces, the brilliance of the advance. Then, on that same 2nd of August, Churchill stands before the House of Commons. The parliamentary record from Hansard preserves what he says. He defends Montgomery. He tells the House that Montgomery's operations have been conducted with great skill. that the main weight of German armor has been drawn to the British front. Two audiences on the same day. Two entirely different messages. One political logic running through both of them. Churchill cannot publicly distance himself from Britain's most famous general. The damage to British military morale, to public confidence, to the image of British military competence, in the eyes of the watching world, would be severe. The political cost at home is too high. Montgomery must be publicly defended. But Churchill also cannot allow Montgomery's private narrative to calcify into received truth at the command level. If the dominant account circulating among Allied commanders becomes that British forces were held back by American failure, that British strategy enabled the American success, which British inadequacy had previously prevented, then the Anglo-American relationship is poisoned from a position of near total British military dependence. That is not a survivable arrangement. So Churchill does both. He defends Montgomery publicly. He protects the alliance privately. He challenges the excuses at the command level. He ensures American achievements are recognized by the people who matter most. And according to Brooke's diary from early August, he tells Brooke directly that Montgomery must stop producing explanations and must start delivering results. Behind closed doors, the Prime Minister is finished with excuses. The Normandy campaign ended in August of 1944 with the destruction of the German 7th Army in the Falaise Pocket. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. By every measure, the Allied campaign had succeeded. But the pattern that crystallized across those 7 weeks, Montgomery's tendency to assign blame outward when operations stalled, and to claim strategic credit retrospectively when they succeeded, did not end at Normandy. It reappeared in September of 1944, during the supply allocation debates, when Montgomery lobbied for resources in ways that required diminishing the American contribution. It reappeared after Market Garden, and it reappeared most destructively during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, when Montgomery's press conference remarks came closer than any single event to destroying the Anglo-American command relationship outright. Each time, Churchill was required to perform the same recalibration, holding the line between his general and his alliance. What most accounts of this period tend to emphasize is the interpersonal tension, the personality conflict between Montgomery and the American commanders, particularly Patton. What they tend to underweight is what Churchill's response actually tells us about the structure of British power in the summer of 1944. Britain was not a co-equal partner in the alliance at that stage of the war. The military production numbers, the manpower figures, the logistics dependency, all of it pointed in one direction. Churchill understood this with a clarity that his private correspondence makes visible in a way his public speeches were designed to conceal. What Churchill said when Montgomery blamed the Americans for his slow progress at Caen was not a moral pronouncement about fairness or about professional conduct between generals. It was a strategic assessment delivered as a private instruction to the man standing at the top of Britain's military hierarchy. We depend on them, utterly. 5 words recorded in a diary, spoken in a corner office, while the maps of Normandy were still being updated by the hour. The city of Caen fell. France was liberated. The alliance held, not because Montgomery's explanations were accepted at face value, not because the tensions between the Allied commanders were ever fully resolved, but because one man in London understood that some things mattered more than protecting his general's reputation. And that understanding, quiet, calculated, and politically costly as it was, may be the most consequential judgment Churchill made in the entire summer of 1944. If this kind of detailed, source-based storytelling is what you look for, share this video with someone who loves real history, not the cleaned-up version. Drop a comment below, telling us what you think Churchill's greatest wartime decision actually was, because the answers might surprise us, and we read every single one. This script draws on Field Marshal Lord Alan Brooks, War Diaries, 1939 to 1945. Edited by Danchev and Todman. Published in 2001. General Omar Bradley's. A Soldier's Story. Published in 1951. General George Patton's diary entries from July 1944. Churchill's preserved correspondence with Smuts and Eisenhower from July and August 1944. The Hansard Parliamentary Record from the 2nd of August 1944. The Operation Goodwood After-Action Records. And the Operation Cobra Operational History from the United States Army. Historical interpretations vary among scholars, and viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources and reach their own conclusions.